Welcome to the Reggie McNeil podcast, where we explore what it means to seek God's kingdom here on earth. Join us on our journey to become more aware of and encouraged by God's work in and around us. In the inaugural series of this podcast, Reggie set out some basic biblical and theological concepts regarding the kingdom. The second series of podcasts featured interviews with leaders who are making a kingdom impact in their communities. Now, in this 3-podcast series, Reggie builds a bridge of how we can get from kingdom insight to kingdom impact. He details the 3 essential shifts we all must make to move to a kingdom-centric posture in our individual lives, as well as in organizations we may lead. Episodes 2 and 3 in the series support these shifts with commentary on the kingdom saga playing out around us and how we can ourselves foster and lead the kingdom movement. So Reggie, let's jump right into today's discussion. You talk a lot about our need to move from a church-centric perspective to one that is kingdom-centric. What exactly do you mean by church-centric, and can you give us some examples of church-centered thinking and practice?
Sure. I think that church-centered has church-centric thinking has become so ensconced in our culture that it just seems normal. Stuff like, for instance, the prevailing notion of church as a place. I mean, that is a very church-centric notion. It's a church as institution notion. We all know the church is a relationship. And from a biblical point of view, it's not a thing. It's not something outside of you or me. It's not something we belong to. We are the church. And yet, in the way that we talk about it in the Western culture, it's an it. It's a vendor of religious goods and services. It's on the corner of 3rd and Main. Some of that you may think, and you may argue, well, that's unavoidable in terms of when movements settle down into institutions. But I'm saying that we've got to go back to the movement if we're going to regain any kind of relevance and if we're going to have any kind of impact on the culture that we should be having. I think another evidence of church-centric thinking is just the scorecard for success. I mean, it's based largely on church activities, led by church people, for church people, primarily on church property. And we've developed a consumer mentality where we develop customers who want to consume our religious programming and evaluate us based on the church down the street. Do we have a better band? Do we have a better youth program or whatever else? And then I would just offer, and although I could keep going, and I know you probably wish I would, but I just think there's a misguided sense of purpose all the way around the board. We think that God's primary mission in the world is building the church, and that's just not so. Jesus didn't say to us, seek first the church. The kingdom is God's primary mission, always has been, always will be, the expression of who he is and what he's up to throughout creation. And so this notion that God gets up every morning with the church on his mind is a very church-centric perspective that keeps us locked in to a wrong worldview and keeps us locked out of being able to participate in God's full agenda on the planet.
Do you think the move from church-centric to kingdom-centric starts with church leaders or with churchgoers?
Oh, I think it's yes. I think, of course, leaders always bear responsibility for the culture that they lead over time. And we've had centuries of church leaders now crafting a very church-centric perspective. And so folks who are members or who are participants who grow up in that culture, they just think it's normal. So I basically hold leaders responsible for this, and I think leaders are also responsible for making the change with a significant caveat, and that is that I'm finding more and more people in the pew, or even who aren't in the pew, but are Jesus followers. They get it, and they are increasingly impatient to wait on church leaders to catch up.
So in your book, you say, quote, in North America, Christianity is viewed largely as a church-centered practice, yielding an organization that is religious, but not necessarily reflective of God's desire for his people. Do you think that this has held true during the past year with the pandemic and everything?
Yeah, I really do. I think, you could almost excerpt any point in, I guess, church history and make that argument depending on how, maybe cynical wouldn't be the right word, but I guess once the movement departed from being a movement and began to settle down in its institutional and ways, I think at that point it departed from God's main purpose for it. I'm not suggesting that there hasn't been a lot of good done by church as institution. In fact, I really think there has been. I think Christianity is well underrated in terms of what it has done over time. I mean, whether it's slavery or women or race or whatever, Christianity's made incredible contributions there and doesn't get credit. However, when it comes to the church helping people understand that we are primarily part of a street movement of a way of being in the world, not just doing church on the weekend, but being the people of God all week long. Yeah, I would say that the pandemic has probably heightened the need for that kind of message. And I have seen some folks valiantly reach to it. I would say, unfortunately, I've seen many more just try to figure out how can we replicate the weekend experience and now make it an online accessible stuff so folks don't, quote, miss church. And I was just reading some statistics this morning as no matter when you hear this podcast, we're doing it at a time where churches are opening back up. And it's interesting to see what people miss. For pastors to realize that only 18% of folks miss the sermon in person. I mean, I've been a pastor. That's pretty devastating because I was pretty certain that's why folks came to church, was to hear me tell them something they didn't know or tell them something that I wasn't doing, but by golly, I wish they would, but I also think that what it did reveal in terms of what people miss, the interaction with others, being with like-minded folk, I think that's kind of an indictment almost. I mean, yeah, you want to be with people that you like and all that, but still, look at that very insular notion. I want to get back to the club. I want to hang out with the people that I know already and share a lot with. And of course, fellowship's important, always has been. But I'm just saying, for that to be the primary driver of why people, have missed being able to gather, just causes us, I think, should give us pause again to say, well, what is it that we've actually created? What is this culture that we've developed? Is it primarily, a culture where folks can escape situations in a world where they feel persecuted or not accepted, or maybe even a world where they don't share values with a lot of folks around them? Of course, that's always a draw. Or do we really see a culture where we're coming to be equipped to actually encounter that world? And as one of my students, doctoral students from Japan, wrote me a few years ago, it seems that the church ought to be kind of an apprenticing and a certification place where we're training people to be missionaries, and we actually certify them. It kind of reminds me of when Jesus finally said, "You got it right there," on his way to, and when he established the church. Way to go, you got it. Now here's what we do with this. So I can't remember your question exactly. You probably wish you hadn't asked it, Hannah, by now, but I think COVID has offered us the opportunity to dive headlong back into the movement. I wish more people had done so.
Mm-hmm. So kind of going off of that, how do you define a non-practicing Christian versus a practicing Christian, especially in an era where people are somewhat less likely to attend in person now and have the option to do it however they want?
It's an interesting concept of practicing or non-practicing. First of all, I rarely use Christian anymore simply because that's in our culture, that's not a word that's exactly revered. In fact, it creates allergic reactions among many folks. And we're reminded that Jesus didn't come to establish a religion, Christianity. We did that. His initial followers were called followers of the way. I prefer, and I always talk of myself and someone like you as a Jesus follower, as opposed to a Christian, because as soon as we do that, and the reason your question is very appropriate, as soon as we do that, we slot it in institutional participation on whether or not we're practicing or non-practicing. And my goodness, I mean, I'm thinking if I just love my neighbor, if I love God with everything I've got and I love my neighbor and I'm, a person of blessing, then that's a practicing Jesus follower, whether or not, it manifests in my participation in a weekend gathering somewhere as a religious expression. Don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not suggesting that people that go to gatherings or that's an improper expression. Not at all. I'm just saying we've got to expand our notion of what we think it means to be a participant in this movement.
So what are some kingdom correctives that we need to make the shift into kingdom-centric life and purpose?
Well, I think first of all, we've got to realize that God established the church to point to the kingdom. I mean, when we're talking about moving from church-centric to kingdom-centric, we got to flip this script here. The kingdom is the foremost. The church was established to point to it, not the other way around. That's the first thing we got to realize. If we get that in our minds, it's like stuff flows downhill from there. That's the major idea. I think, secondly, we got to acknowledge, as because of that the kingdom is the destination, not the church. There again, the church has a role to play in history, but the church goes out of business. I mean, it's not the fourth member of the Trinity. It's not forever, but it's the kingdom that's forever because God exists and His kingdom exists with Him, and as an extension of His person. And so that's what's forever. And sometimes some of my listeners, if you've listened long or been with me anywhere, I use the analogy of an airport hub. The airport's never the destination. I mean, no one wakes up saying, hot dog, I get to go, spend a day at the airport. But they are jazzed about their destination, but the airport's what it takes to get them there. And so I think in that way, the church should be a hub and realize we're a hub, but we're not the point. I mean, no one comes home. I mean, no one. I've never visited anyone's home on their coffee table where they have books, great airports of the world. I mean, we spent 3 days there once. It was fabulous. I mean, are you kidding? That would be like the trip to Hades. So, as soon as we could get off this kick of thinking that we're the point, then we can get refocused again on, folks come here. And by the way, some folks work full time at the airport. It is a destination for them. That's the clergy in the church to make sure that people are getting where they want to go. And so I think helping us understand what the real destination is also helps us move in a kingdom-centric way. And then I think that we have to realize that the kingdom saga focuses primarily on the welfare of the community and not on the church. So that means that our stats of how successful we are need to be tied to the success of our communities. I mean, it's like when Israel was hauled off into Babylon in exile, and we know this, famous chapter in Jeremiah where God tells them, chapter 29, look, seek the welfare of the city. Don't just huddle down and hope to get out of here. Pray for it, work for it, bless the folks where you are. And I think in many ways, if we understand the real scorecard is our communities are doing better, then we would quit this silliness of saying, our community's going to hell in a handbasket, but boy, are we having a great church experience. I mean, how crazy is that? That's not our, that just absolutely refuses to accept the stewardship that we've been handed. And then I think I would say finally, just to recognize that God is at work. He's at work. We're not taking God out, on a stroll. We're not bringing God to the city. God's already in the city. We're not, reaching people for Jesus. God, people don't want to be reached. They've seen some of their friends reached. It's like, being abducted by aliens. I mean, they can't find them anymore because they just get, enmeshed in the church culture. This is not all. We've got to rethink all of that stuff. It's about joining God in the work He's already up to all around us and seeing that. That will help us move to a kingdom-centric perspective.
So let's assume that our listeners want to make this shift, becoming more of what you advocate, that we should be viral kingdom agents. What are some tips or observations to help them make the move?
Well, first, I wouldn't sit around waiting on the world to change. I mean, someone should do a song like that, don't you think? I mean, yeah. It would probably sell like crazy. Maybe we could do a duet version or something. Well. Okay, so but honestly, be the change you want to be. Don't sit around. I would also say that ordering your prayer life around the kingdom, something like, Lord, help me see you at work. I had a pastor friend who asked his folks to spend some time, during their week just to get their brains ready for what he was going to say the next week. This was back in the days when people went to church. And his assignment was, spend an hour, sitting at Walmart or Target or somewhere. I mean, don't be creepy about it, but I mean, just, sit there and just ask God, Lord, help me see what's going on in these people. I mean, the last time I was at Target, they were just in my way, when I was trying to get to the, turn something back in. But what if I actually was looking around and say, Lord, help me understand what you're up to. Help me see what you're doing. And then I think even journaling that would be a smart thing to do. I think a lot of times we run into God, if we're aware of it, just jotting that down, reading back over that after 30 days, it would be remarkable what people would understand, even prayer walking in their neighborhoods. I'm telling you, the Spirit gives us hints about what's going on in people's lives, even from the exchanges on the streets, or even as we're walking by our neighbors and we're praying for that family that's inside that structure, that home that they've built, and just listen to what the Spirit has to say to you. Now, I grew up as in a Baptist tradition, so we weren't expecting God to talk to us, but the truth is He is, and He will, if we kind of open our minds to it. I would also, as an observation or an encouragement, invite some others in. Let some other folks know what you're doing and ask them to do the same thing, compare notes. I think that would be fun. And then I think you might just determine what it is that you would like to do, and we're going to come back to this in a podcast in this series, but what it is that breaks your heart or gets you interested, I would pay attention to that, because that may be where the Spirit's tugging you. This is where God wants you to do some really good work.
So some of our listeners are leaders in the church world. They're charged with their responsibility for leading and managing the church as institution. So what advice do you have for them?
Okay, here's what this is the big piece for you as a leader. If you're going to pull off a culture shift, you've got to pay attention to three things. And you don't get a pass on any of these three. You got to do all three. You have to change the story. In other words, the narrative of what it is that you're up to. You've got to change the scorecard, meaning what you celebrate. And then you've got to change the stewardship of what you think you have a responsibility for. Now, let's just look at those real quickly. And we've been talking this whole podcast about changing the story, the narrative. What is the big story that God is? In fact, I get on a plane tomorrow. I fly to a bunch of church leaders, and they're trying to consider how they're going to begin to bless their communities. If they don't get the story right, they're not going to get, if they don't get the why right, they're not going to get the what right. Even if they say, all right, as a church, we're going to go bless the city. No, you're not. I mean, yeah, you can, but this is not about, let's go be a great church by blessing the city. No, you've got to have this notion that you're joining God in blessing the city, because God wants a great city and He wants great people. And so the story has to be a kingdom story, warp and woof. It can't be a church story with a thin coat of kingdom. It's got to be all the way authentic. People, when they come in contact with your church, they need to get the kingdom story, that God has a life for them that he's very intentional about. He wants them to enjoy that life, and he's gone to enormous lengths, including visiting the planet and living the life for us so we could see it. And that's the kingdom story. Now, the second thing is the scorecard, what we celebrate, which means that we've got to begin in our gatherings, in our church correspondence, or web, or whatever, however we're communicating. We've got to start making heroes of people who are, in fact, helping other people live better lives. I mean, one of my colleagues has a habit of asking folks during their church gatherings, where are you going to be 24 hours from now? And how are you going to be living out this Jesus following in that say? You see, I think that makes it come alive. That shows that this is halftime. The game is life. The gathering, the church stuff. Nobody plays a game so you can have halftime. You have halftime so you can play a game. So we've got the scorecard needs to reflect the game. How many fewer hungry kids are there? How many kids can read on a grade level so that they have a chance of getting a job? How many jobs are we creating? How many people with mental health issues are we helping find the help that they need? You see, these are much different, metrics than we're currently following. How many people come? How much money do they bring? How often do they come? What's their average attendance in a month? How long do they stay on our website when they, come into our service? I mean, we've got to do better than that. And then the third thing that I mentioned is our stewardship. If we think it's our job as church leaders to run an institution, then that's what we're going to do. If we think it's our job as church leaders to have the stewardship of pastoring or leading a missionary movement, to partner with God in what he's doing in our community, then we have a very different stewardship. Now, I'll add a fourth thing right now, and the reason I only do it as a PS to these first three things is you've got to change: the story, and the scorecard, and the stewardship. I even alliterate it so you can remember it. The fourth thing would be the structure. But the reason I bring it up as a fourth thing is far too many leaders of institutions start with structure. And that's not where you start. Because if you start with the structure, first of all, you're going to run headlong into massive resistance before you got to get the why right. Then the structure is another what and how issue. And you can get to that. But I wouldn't fool with the Constitution, bylaws, and how we do business and all that kind of stuff until you're actually operating in a different way. Then let the structures and stuff reflect your new way of being. So I think that's what I would say. I know that's a lot of stuff to dump on leaders, but that's your job. I mean, you are a leader for something.
So kind of going off of that, in your book, Kingdom Come, you also say, quote, living out the mission of the kingdom must accompany or at times even precede our preaching of the message of the kingdom. How do you live out the mission of the kingdom? Like, how do you practice what you preach, really?
Yeah, and here again, if we as church leaders, I'll give you an example. So recently I talked with a church leader who was leading his congregation to become more engaged with the community, and they felt that God was calling them to work in the schools. They were initially rebuffed. They finally found one school that would let them be a part of blessing them and working with them. It took about 7 years to move from that initial contact into a relationship where this pastor had a personal relationship with the principal that was so strong that spiritual conversations were not unusual. In fact, led to this principal becoming a Jesus follower. And so, that's serving on your knees first to gain an opportunity for people to hear. It used to be in the Reformation, post-Reformation world that proclamation preceded demonstration. You proclaimed the truth, you told people how to live, everyone flocked to the church to get their stuff and then go out there and try it out. Today's world, it's demonstration that precedes proclamation. And you've got to be a living proof of something different for folks to say, well, hey, what's going on with that person? Why are you motivated like you do? Why do you do what you do? Then you have an answer, as Peter said, for the hope that's in you. That's why we got to live our lives in such a way that people actually ask us, what's different about you?
Yeah. Agreed. So we've covered a lot of ground today. If you want to dive into any of this discussion further, you'll find Reggie's book, Kingdom Come, a helpful resource. You can order it off of Reggie's website, reggiemcneil.org, or on Amazon, or wherever you buy your books. Thank you, Reggie, for challenging us to live more kingdom-centric lives.
Oh, thank you, Hannah.